Okay. You ready now? Okay. This is Hades' Daughter, Book 1 of the Troy Game by Sara Douglas. Chapter 3. Irrelevance, decay, death, catastrophe. Every place that Theseus lay foot, everything he touched, every part of his world. This was Ariadne's curse, and with it, in gratitude to Asterion for teaching her the dark craft, Ariadne did what only she had the power to do. She unwound the game, that great and ancient sorcery that underpinned and protected the entire Aegean world. It began 9 days after Ariadne twined the flowers into the basket that cradled her daughter. Miriam, the midwife, who had thought to cut Ariadne open to save her child, was standing in the central village open space, the beach where Theseus had abandoned Ariadne a bare 2 weeks previously, some 60 paces distant into the south. It was dawn. What? You have your unicorn. Yeah, okay. What? Okay. Sheesh. It was dawn, the air chill, only the faintest of pink staining the eastern sky, the birds in their trees chirping quietly to start the day. Miriam had no thought for the beauty of the beach, the dawn light, or even for the sweet melodies of the birds. Instead, she stared frowning at the empty wicker basket lying at her feet. Flowers, withered and colorless, still wound about its rim. Why didn't she take it with her? Miriam muttered, then bent to pick up the basket. In the instant before her fingers touched the basket, one of the flowers slid free from the wickerwork and fell to the earth. The instant it hit, the chorus of the birds turned from melody to a frightful, fractured screaming. Instinctively, Miriam straightened and looked about her, her heart thudding. Birds rose in chaotic clouds from the trees surrounding the village, milled briefly in the air, then turned to fly north. Their screams sounded like the shriek of a blade on a whetstone. Miriam put her hands over her ears and half crouched, panicked, but not knowing what to do. She wanted to run, but she did not know what to run from or where to run to. About her, men, women, and children were stumbling from doorways, pulling clothes about them, shouting in confusion. Something terrible was about to happen. Miriam knew it. Just as certainly... Are you all right in there? Something terrible was about to happen. Miriam knew it, just as certainly as she knew that whatever was going to happen was a result of Ariadne. Why, Miriam whispered, why hate us this much? Then, everything went still. The birds had gone, their panic and their screeching gone with them. The villagers, who had tumbled from their beds into the village, now stood with their voices quiet, looking south over the beach to the calm sea. It was south. Whatever was so very wrong was south. A dog whined, then another, and Miriam had the thought that the cacophony of the birds was about to be replaced by an equally frightful shrieking of the village dogs. It never happened. At the very moment the thought crossed Miriam's mind, there was a blinding flash of light far to the south. The light, first white, then a terrible orange, was reflected both in the thin haze of the clouds and in the sea, magnifying its effects 100-fold. Miriam, as all who stood transfixed with her, barely had time to gasp before they first felt their eardrums swell and burst, and then were lifted far off their feet by a pressure blast of such magnitude and heat that most were dead before they hit the ground. Those who were not killed in the initial blast died when the molten rock rained from the sky, or when, just as the sun finally crested the flaming horizon, the first of 6 successive tidal waves washed over the low-lying lands of Naxos. By the time the sun had reached its noon peak, the Aegean world had turned gray and black. Dense clouds of ash, pulverized rock, deadly gases, and steam had mushroomed 20 miles into the sky and spread over the entire eastern Mediterranean region. Thick, choking, poisonous ash drifted down to layer corpses and ruins alike, with eventually 200 feet of death. The island of Thera, which sat almost halfway between Crete and Naxos, and which contained in its harbor the glorious shining city of Atlantis, had exploded with such force that the entire island, save for a thin, sorry rim of smoking rock, vanished beneath the waves. In its dying, Thera poisoned every land and every city within 4 days' sailing. Thera was only the first, but admittedly the most spectacular step in Ariadne's curse. Thera's eruption not only largely destroyed Naxos, but also the northern coastline of Crete. Tidal waves and the murderous rain of molten rock and ash inundated villages, harbors, and the great founding labyrinth that lay partway between the coast and the city of Knossos, which lay almost 2 miles inland. Thera, Naxos, and Crete, as well as a score of smaller islands within reach of either the initial cataclysmic blast or the tidal waves, was devastated. Farther distant, the north and south and the lands of Greece, Anatolia, the Levant, and Egypt, the effects were not so initially devastating, but crept more secretly upon the peoples of the region. Crops failed for years afterward, and any man or woman who had breathed too deeply of the ash that continued to trickle out of the sky for months after the initial explosion often succumbed to terrible growths in their lungs in later life. Wells were poisoned, livestock and children alike sickened and died. People rebelled and overthrew governments and societies and abandoned their gods. In Egypt, a man called Moses used the death that rained down from Thera to force the pharaoh to set his people free. In Athens, Theseus watched as his queen, Phaedra, died in an agonizing childbed, calling out her sister's name. In sorrow, he comforted himself with a young virgin called Helen, before he set off on many wandering adventures about the Aegean, looking for his own revenge on the woman who had cursed him. He never found her, but found everywhere the effects of her curse, and in his very wanderings spread the effects of Ariadne's curse farther and farther. It was why she had not killed him outright. Having survived Thera's massive destruction, the people of those Aegean cities discovered, to their horror, that the game that had protected them for countless generations was failing. The game, the labyrinth mystery of great power and sorcery, was used to entrap the evil that was always drawn to communities of wealth and contentment. Without it, cities became increasingly vulnerable to the predations of evil, wrongdoing, misfortune, greed and sloth and hubris, and all those mischiefs that haunt success and happiness. Cities fell to invaders from the north and west, or were consumed by earth tremors, or by fire. Evil incarnate itself walked free. Ariadne's destruction of the game and of the protective sorcery meant that Asterion was reborn into life to work his malevolence and depravity where and as he pleased. In vain did the kingsmen of the cities, those men who through birth and training worked the magic of the game alongside their city's mistress of the labyrinth, try to arrest the decline. It was pointless, because the mischief that ate at the game's powers had been generated by the greatest mistress of them all, Ariadne, who had controlled the founding game at Knossos on Crete, and who had most apparently found the means to undo all the workings of lesser mistresses about the Aegean. And Ariadne could not be found. She could not be stopped, and her mischief, as that of her half-brother, could not be arrested. There was worse. As the lands and cities failed, falling to mischief after mischief, so along the gods failed. Whatever Ariadne had tapped into, it was so powerful that it affected even the gods on their great heights. The cataclysmic explosion of Thera had shattered both the equanimity and the confidence of the gods. It had also seriously depleted their power, and thus their means, to try to undo what Ariadne had wrought. Thera's beautiful circular harbor had contained a great island, the island within the island, upon which rose the majestic citadel of Atlantis, center of Aegean culture and supremacy. Atlantis had also contained the ancient and mystical god well, the major source of succor and power for the gods. Without it, the gods were not only ineffective, but they grew ever more so as each day passed. With the destruction of Thera and Atlantis, Ariadne had dealt a killing blow to the gods at the very start of the unwinding of her curse. At the height of their powers, the gods could have stopped her. Now they could do little but mouth feeble curses themselves and succumb to the evil that stalked every part of Aegean life. And so, as the seasons passed, and year turned into year, Ariadne's curse wrapped the Aegean world in its malevolent web. There were meager moments of glory, an occasional hour of laughter, but they became increasingly rare, and they passed entirely that day that the Trojan prince called Paris, enamored of the beautiful wife of the Spartan king, Menelaus, stole her back to his home, city of Troy. Menelaus' wife was Helen, the girl who had confronted Theseus when Phaedra had died, and who had given him her virginity. Touched by Theseus, Helen was herself a walking curse. In her name, all of Greece embarked upon an exhausting 10-year siege of Troy that ensnarled not only the Greeks and the Trojans, but the gods themselves. Weakened by the continuing effects of Thera's eruption, as well as by the progressively worsening deterioration of the game, Troy's collapse dealt the final death blow to the ancient Aegean gods. Many died amid Troy's smoking ruins. Others crept away to agonizing, lonely deaths amid the rocky peaks of Olympus. A few managed to keep drawing breath. Aphrodite, who secured Aeneas' escape from Troy, along with the magical kingship bands of the city. Hera, who weeping swore a revenge for Ariadne's destruction of all that was lovely. Poseidon, who crept away to his watery haven and took no further part in the lives of mortals. And Hades, who alone among the gods found a measure of strength within all the death. Within a generation or two of Troy's destruction, Aphrodite had gone, murdered by her sorrow, and Poseidon was nothing more than a faint blue shadow moving slowly within the ocean's depths. Hades kept to his underworld, wanting no more to do with the mortal realm. Only Hera, crippled, dying a little more each day, was left to try to undo what Ariadne had wrought. And that concludes chapter 3, as well as the introduction. Next time, part 1. Till then.